Millions of people across 6 continents, including 1 in 25 Americans, have reported a near-death experience. John Burke is one of the foremost experts in the world on near-death experiences. He is the New York Times best-selling author of Imagine Heaven, and his latest blockbuster, Imagine the God of Heaven. For 30-plus years, John has researched thousands of these accounts and reports and says they are strikingly similar, yet breathtakingly unique to each person.
They commonly say they were in a world more real than this world, and all over the globe they see the same God of light, who consistently, they say, this God is love, and what matters most to this God is how we love and treat one another. And they would say nothing at all could compare to just being in the presence of God. That God is actually the love you have always wanted.
It is a fascinating new book. John Burke, welcome to 700 Club Interactive.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew.
Your personal story is really interesting because you're not, I mean, if someone sees this book and thinks, okay, this is a pastor trying to convince us of certain things, not true. I mean, you've been on a 3-decade journey, and the way you began this journey is fascinating. 1978, right, or so? What happened?
Yeah. Well, my dad was dying of cancer. I was an agnostic. You know, I'm an engineer by trade, so I have a very skeptical, analytical mind. And someone gave him the very first research on near-death experiences. When someone clinically dies, you know, no heartbeat, no brain waves, and yet they come back saying they experienced the life to come more real than this life. And I read that book in one night, and I said, wow, could this actually be evidence that this God, Jesus stuff might be real? And that began, like you said, over 3-decade study for me. In the meantime, I went from engineering to becoming a pastor.
How did that happen? Partly because of your research and inquiries into this?
Well, the near-death experiences opened me to the possibility that here's something tangible that people are commonly saying, and it's common. You know, the millions of people around the globe, not only the Gallup polls reported that, but the European Academy of Neuroscience just did a study in 2019 across 35 countries, and 5% of the population of the world apparently is having these experiences. So that opened me up, but then I got into a small group Bible study, and I actually started studying the history of God, of this God, and realizing that there were other great reasons to believe, and I came to faith in
Perhaps
Christ.
Being a skeptic is one of the reasons God chose you to tell about these experiences. Now, often it's the church itself who's the most cynical about NDEs, as you call them in your book, near-death experiences. Why do you think that is? Do you have any insight on that?
Well, it's part of why it took me 35 years to write the first book. Well, because it can be confusing. And I talk about, in Imagine the God of Heaven, how there's a difference between what people commonly report in their near-death experience and how they might interpret what they report. And I show how, for instance, people consistently are reporting this God of incredible light, brighter than the sun, thousands of times brighter, but not hard to look at, mesmerizing, and a love that our word love doesn't even do justice to. Personal, not impersonal. And many come back seeking, and they discover the God who revealed. That same God of light appeared on Mount Sinai to Moses, right? And Jesus said, I am the light of the world. And he was transfigured, his face brighter than the sun. So I trace through the scriptures how this is the same God, but some come back and they don't know, and they might say, oh, this was the goddess Durga or Kali. And interestingly, I point that out, how they're not describing what we would know of the goddess Durga. They're describing the same God who's been revealing himself throughout history, interestingly, as the God of all nations. And what I'm showing in Imagine the God of Heaven is really the love story of God for all nations. You know, it starts all the way in Genesis, where we are made for relationship with God. We betray God. And yet in Genesis 12, he makes a plan, and he raises up Abraham and Sarah and says, I'm going to bless you, and you're going to be a blessing to all the nations. And then we see that theme throughout. Jesus comes and he dies for all of our sins, and he says, go tell it to all the nations. And then in Revelation 7, you see around the throne a multitude that can't be counted from every nation and tribe and people group and language.
So those are some of the things that might surprise people about the book. You're not just talking about NDEs or near-death experiences, but the God behind it.
Exactly.
And one of the, I think, another part of your book that was striking to me is you talk about these people who report these near-death experiences. They actually have a lot to lose by relating their story. They make themselves vulnerable or targets. And you talk about the fact that in some cases it takes bravery because people are skeptical, especially when they're professionals who come out and say this, or people in the medical field, et cetera.
Well, and the majority of people I interview for that very reason, because I don't know, I can't check all of them out, but we're talking about CEOs, spine surgeons, commercial airline pilots, lawyers, engineers, people from different religious backgrounds, and yet they're now claiming they experienced the God of the Bible. And these people have a lot to lose. Yeah. They don't, you know, they're not doing this to make money. They have plenty. And I think that's important because it helps verify as well, because when they're saying the same things consistently, and yet it's costing them something. That's the best testimony in a court of law. If you have unique testimony that overlaps, it's the best testimony you can have. And that's what we see with NDEs.
And there's so many accounts in here. Are there one or two that you just carry with you that have made the biggest impression on you or the most special to you, memorable?
There are a lot. but I'll tell you, one of the ones in the new book, in Imagine the God of Heaven, is Santosh, who grew up in India, a manufacturing engineer. When he dies, this incredible God of light, that he says he knew this is a divine light, supreme authority. He had to obey this light, but he fell in love with this light. And this God of light takes him, and he takes him to this place where he's standing up, and what he describes is a city, but he calls it a compound, a walled compound. With high walls in a square shaped. He said, gorgeous inside. He wanted to go in, he said, and 12 gates, I counted them, 12 gates. And your eyesight there is, you can see for miles and thousands of miles. And he perfectly describes the city of God, just like John describes in Revelation chapter 21, but he knew nothing about it. And then he describes seeing who he says is the Almighty on his throne, and he knew it. And he gets a life review, and he also sees a vision of hell.
What life review?
A life review.
For people who that breezes by quick, but what do you mean by that?
Well, that's one of the commonalities, is in God's presence many times, he shows us our lives. And just like it says in 2 Peter 3:8, to the Lord 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. Well, that's what they say. Time didn't work the same way. So they re-experience their life, but they see it not just from their own perspective, but from the perspective of every person they interacted with, and how every little action, good or bad, had a ripple effect through humanity. And how what God cares most about is how we treat one another, that matters. And so Santosh sees all this, and he experiences from God that because of his sin, he deserved this abyss. And yet when God speaks to him, he says, Santosh, I'm going to send you back. And he felt such love and mercy and grace from God he didn't understand. And next to this throne, he sees what he called a very narrow door or gate that was open to him. The rest of the gates weren't open to him. But just this narrow gate was open to him into the kingdom of heaven. And because of God's love for him that he felt, he got bold and he said, Lord, when I come back, I want to go through that narrow gate. And he does come back to earth. And 2 years later, his daughter is invited to sing in a church, and he goes in, not only experiences the presence of this God of love, but the message that day was on the narrow gate.
Wow.
And how Jesus is the gate through which we must enter into heaven. And he realized, he went back and started reading the Bible, and he said, everything I experienced is in this book. And he came to faith in Jesus.
And the magnificence of heaven, the beauty, the love, it captures our hearts. Now, you also report here on people who've had the opposite experience regarding hell.
Right. Yeah, and so 23% of people who have come forward with near-death experiences report hellish experiences. And we don't even know if that's the percent because many people don't come forward. Yeah. But that's real too. And, you know, in the book, I talk about how God's justice met God's love on the cross because God can't wink at our sin. That's one of the things Santosh said. He said, God is holy, he's pure. And, you know, I can't get rid of my past. So what's gonna cleanse me to be able to go in? And that's what he realized, is that God's love and justice met on the cross so that every person in every nation can turn their heart back to God and be made right with him.
What an amazing change God has made in your heart from where you were, you know.
Well, it's a lot of, all of this is a lot of what led me into ministry to help people see what I was discovering. Like, how can you not believe when you see all this?
Yeah. And so this is a unique, your ministry is unique because as a pastor, this is such a big part of your messaging or the foundation, right? I'm not saying you preach about it all the time, but you have a passion inside.
Well, I believe, Andrew, that this is God's global apologetic for such a time as this. You know, if you think about it, every time evil raises its ugly head, God raises his testimony. It happened right after the Holocaust with the refounding in 1948 of Israel. And right now, in this time, I think this is part of what God's doing. He's bringing testimony forth from all nations that he is the God of all nations, and he loves all people, and he wants all people to turn back to him.
It's a fascinating book. Imagine the God of Heaven. Really appreciate you being with us.
Thanks so much.
All right, you can learn more about these near-death experiences in John's book. The book is called Imagine the God of Heaven. It's in stores nationwide. You can also visit his website, imaginethegodofheaven.com.
Hello, I'm Gordon Robertson. Thanks for watching the video. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more encouraging videos like this one. Welcome to the 700 Club Interactive family, and God bless you.